Okay. Hello, all MicroGiants. We're back together after kind of our summer break and kind of raring to go. Today we have Edgar Martin and Jean-Paul Beal on our little panel here. We're going to have a discussion briefly about why we go into business and perhaps what some of the long-term goals ought to be. So we'll have an open discussion here after I go through a couple of these slides. The interesting thing when you ask the question is, well, why do people start a business? Here's like the results of a survey, and you can see that the vast majority of them, about 25%, they're ready to be their own boss. And then the next group is they wanted to pursue their passion. And then the opportunity presented itself, just sort of came up, decided to go into business. And then you've got laid off people, dissatisfied with corporate use, and a couple of other smaller things. But nowhere in this particular survey do they say they want to make money. Now there's these not ready to retire, or other, we're only like 0.5%. I have to believe that more than 0.5% want to make money. But usually when this subject is kind of discussed a little bit, people say, well, no, I have to make the same kind of a living that I always did, and I'd like to make a little bit more money than that as well. And then occasionally people say, well, I'm getting in this thing to really make some money. But you can see that that's really not, typically when you ask small business people while they go into business, it's not to create money, or a lot of money. So we want to talk about, well, how about building value? And we in MicroGiants, we talk about value in a couple of ways. First of all, it's a promotional item. We tell customers that we're giving you a good value because we're discounting the product for the week or the month or whatever, or it's on sale, and you've got a good value because we lowered the price. And then in marketing, we talk a lot about the customer's perceived value of what do they perceive to be the overall value of a product or of the company brand itself. And then there are several other ways that you can use the word value, of course. But today we want to talk about this issue of creating value in the company itself, an intrinsic value, so that it becomes an asset that you can actually use to sell and make some money, or to pass on to someone else in some other way. The problem is we don't typically think very much about that. People don't go into business with the idea, they're going to sell it. They go into business to stay in business first, and then someday they start thinking about selling it. In order to sell, you have to create some kind of a value that somebody will actually buy. And so we thought we would just kind of kick this open just a little bit. We've got two entrepreneurs here today, and we're just going to throw around this concept of overall value in a company. So what we tend to have when we think about value, the first thing that happens is we get into, well, how do you value your company? And one of our MicroGiants experts, Ed Lasak, has focused on that, and as a CPA and as someone who has sold 2 or 3 or 4 large companies, he pretty much understands that, and he also has done a lot of specialized work in valuation, and he's certified in doing business asset valuations. As a matter of fact, the 3 Consulting Amigos, which is sort of a group of experts at MicroGiants, has done several videos on this subject, and we'll put them in the body of the notes down below so that you can look them up. But we've done probably 6 or 7 versions that have to do with strategy, and at the same time talking about the ultimate goal of building value. One of them is getting out of business using an ESOP program. ESOP, that happens to be, strangely enough, our most popular program on our MicroGiants YouTube channel. By that, I mean like 5 times more than the number 2. And so ESOP is employee-owned stock program, I think. Basically, what that does is that builds a corporation from a small ownership, a private company, builds a corporation by selling to the employees of the company, so that by simply working there, they get a share of the company. It has a lot of rules. People have to abide by the equivalent of a CPA, who is a caretaker in a sense and watches over the rules to make sure everything is being run properly on behalf of the employees. So you still have managers who are making decisions, but the difference is that when the company's assets increase, the employees take a share of that. And then when they go out of the company for whatever reason, once they're vested, then they have a marketable asset that they can sell to other new employees. Not everybody can do this because you have to have a pretty nice going concern to do that. The companies tend to be from 60 to 300 people. But that's one way that an owner who wouldn't otherwise have a buyer can actually create his or her own buyers in order to be able to get out of the business. Typically, there's a lot of borrowing involved, and so it does put the company under a liability issue. Some might call it a little bit of a liability stress because you're borrowing money. You may or may not have the ability to borrow money, but many times a company with an owner, say, that has been there for 20 or 30 years and is now retiring, usually that company doesn't have very much debt. So it sets it up as a nice way to do that. But I think part of the intriguing piece here is that entrepreneurs don't think about creating value very often. When I went into business, I didn't think about selling it necessarily. I didn't think that I would try to market whatever company came out of that. Later on down the road, I did buy out 2 partners, brought in another partner as an investment. So, I mean, I recognized upon going into business that things do change. Ownership can be flexible. You know, I got that. But I never really thought that what we're trying to accomplish is to build value long term. Now, one example, and I've mentioned them before, but the second largest private company in the world is the big oil company that is owned by, and I'm just, for some reason, I'm missing the name of the guys who do this, but they're the gentlemen who a lot of people get upset with because they tend to give money to conservative causes. I'll think of them in the course of our conversation here. But that particular company has grown from, I believe they inherited $1 to $2 million. So, I mean, that was, 40 or 50 years ago, that was some money. There's no doubt about that. But they're now, as the second largest private company in the world, they're worth billions today. So they turned their company and companies into this multinational billion-dollar level company over a period of 20, 30, 40 years. So, how did that happen? And it happened because they have a very unique byword, guideline about how they think about their company. It's almost part of their strategy. And that is that they think very seriously about value. And they're talking in this case about asset value. What is a company worth? And they have a policy. Now, they have a lot of companies and they have managers, presidents of each company. And each one of those people there knows that if the company is valued by more outside than inside, that they will automatically put the company up for sale. In other words, if you think that our company is worth more than we think, you can buy it and we will sell it to you. That is what they're about. And so they're buying and selling companies because they look at a company, they see how it fits with their capabilities. And if they think the value is low enough, based on their formula, they'll try to buy it. But if somebody says, no, it's only worth such and such, they go, no, that's not the threshold, we'll sell that. And so they use this formula. But if somebody comes and says, I'll give you $1 million more than you think it's worth, it's like, no problem, we'll sell it. So, I mean, that's their mentality. That's how they got to be so big. Now, so I think what I'm interested in maybe starting off with here in our discussion is just to kind of go to each of you and say, okay, have you thought about how long your company will be around and how you're going to increase the assets of your company so that it's valuable?
Well, I could start.
Sure.
Yes and no. I suppose I only sort of half thought about it. When I started OCB, I had an idea and a mission I wanted to undertake. It was kind of a COVID project, actually, even if I'm completely honest.
Yeah.
And I thought it would be a going concern. I knew that I wanted it to, in effect, pay for itself. I mean, I did put an initial investment in, and it's done pretty well about paying for all the items that it's come across as it's grown. There are some things I really didn't consider at this point in time about scaling it. You know, the time necessary at this stage in its growth cycle, it's become a little more hands-on. Our holiday season's our busiest time of the year, and this holiday season's a lot more involved than last season. That's great. And I mean, the company may be making money. I personally am not making money. I cut the occasional check to make sure that I'm able to meet my obligations. I do have the ability to borrow somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
I do kind of think about what it's worth, but I don't think, because I come from a finance background, so I've been thinking about it like on a revenue multiple basis as to sort of roughly what the revenue stream is worth. But, I don't know that I would be that sort of person that's like, okay, well, someone approached me with a really fat check, I think I'd just cut and run. I have a sentimental attachment to it that I think probably is, that prices into the equation too.
Right.
Notwithstanding, I think that my understanding of our mission and our supply chain, our sourcing practices is nuanced enough that I don't think that the company would be the same if it went under other management. Ron, you recommended I watch that Burt's Bees documentary last season, and I did.
Yeah.
And I mean, you look at the back of a Burt's Bees lip balm label anymore. Their ingredients list is a mile long. It's funny. Everybody buys Burt's Bees because it has this healthy, wholesome, all natural look, but you actually look at the back of the label, it's not anything like what Burt founded anymore.
Right.
And
right.
I mean, it's still a great company. And it's amazing what they managed to achieve. But once it went under Clorox management, there's just a different way these companies are run. And, I could get up on a soapbox on this. I think that that small town and rural America has really suffered in the cycle of the last 70 years, where M&A and roll-ups have been sort of the default option. The small town newspaper, a lot of these grocery chains, as those have gotten rolled up into larger and more impersonal corporations, it makes it difficult for smaller towns to keep talent, to keep value within its local economies. All those get sucked up to big cities, which, I don't think my company is all about. I have some philosophical thoughts on this. Certainly I'm in this business to try and make money. I don't want to lose money on what I'm doing. But it's not as simple as if someone would just walk up and offer me a big check that I'd,
Well,
take the
right.
pill,
I mean, you're in your infancy. Both of you have just started your businesses, and so it's really not a fair question in some ways. But once you get to the point to where you go, oh my, I've got employees, I've got a net profit, I'm paying myself money. Then you have a tendency to think, well, maybe I can do more with this. But a lot of us don't anyway. We just kind of lope forward and just think it's going to be making money. So
the perspective I have, I think, comes from my customers. They've been in business 10 years, been in business 30 years,
yeah,
and they've been stuck on a cycle based on repetition, right? Or just the fact that what took us to get to where we're at today was so difficult that thinking of anything else like scaling it, making it sellable, it's something that they don't even consider in their mind, I believe, because of the fear and the uncertainty of how difficult it's going to be to get to that level. That's what I feel is kind of like the main thing when it comes to why I feel like people that start their businesses, in reality, like you had your graph, is to be their own bosses. I mean, I'll go back and quote one of the most popular books for anybody who's an entrepreneur, Rich Dad Poor Dad.
Right.
Which is, that's not an asset, that's self-employment. And if you want to build yourself a profitable asset, you have to consider it a business. Even if you're small, you have to treat it like one, right? And so often, I guess, my business right now, I don't get to follow the same rules. I'm the self-employed guy, I'm doing everything. But I feel like my job is to help these businesses eventually make their hard work potentially sellable.
Right.
So I get to experience it from the perspective of my customers, what it feels like and their despair, right?
Yeah.
How difficult it is to make it sellable, I think, especially a restaurant.
Right.
Scalable, they get to 5 locations, the most to 20 locations. You could see those guys already have gone to that level, kind of already have a sellable asset. But anybody that has 4 or 5, let's just say even 6 either locations, are in that I'm everything still. Right. And they stop right about there is where the average person says, I need to scale back, or like they grow to 6, 5, 4. And they're like, I'm going back to my one location that feeds my family.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this to you before, but when I used to when I was doing work for this national consulting company, one of the jobs I did was to poll all of our 2,000 stores, and I discovered, no one really wanted to hear this, but I discovered that profit got stuck, at high levels for the first store. They were successful, and then they opened their second store, and they didn't make any money, and so their profit dropped as a percentage. And then the third store, the same thing. They didn't get back to the original profit until the 4th store. And so, people naturally assume that, well, I did it once and it'll just happen again. But it doesn't happen very often, where you open one successful store, restaurant, and then the next one's as good. Almost never does that happen. Because partially, while you might have really smart owners, unless you've got the big corporate structure for location analysis and all that kind of stuff and lots of data, if your first location works, it's partially luck. It's like, oh, this is going to be good. I love it. It's got a corner, got plenty of parking. Everything looks really great. You open and you think you're a genius. But it happened also that the location was a good location and your food was good and you did everything else right. So, I mean, it's a combination of luck. And my point there really overall is that it's so hard to get started that a lot of businesses don't assume they're going to be in a place where it becomes valuable enough to sell. And so they don't even think about it or worry about it. But there are a few things I've learned in talking to Ed Lasek, and that is that the way that you do your management and the way that you construct your financial statements has a lot to do with how people look at your business when you finally get there. And so if you have a business and you finally eventually build it to $1 million or 5 million, $10 million, you got something there that you think, well, gee, that ought to be valuable. But so often, if you're making 2 or 3% profit, like in manufacturing operation, and JP, you do the multiple and you go, well, in this industry, you get 4 times, your profit. And you multiply that out and you go, okay, well, then that's what I'm going to sell it for, is 4 times profit. But it might be that it's actually worth a whole lot more if you construct it right. And so, one of the things that I have observed is that rarely do small businesses who don't, say, exceed $1 million really ever make any money for the business. Now, certainly the owner can be making a nice salary of $1 million and live well and have a nice car and do the things that they want. Once they've gotten enough cash in the bank to run the business and the growth slows down, then it can work pretty well. But a lot of times they take more out of the business than they should, and therefore they're sucking value out of the business. And what do they do with it? Well, if they're buying nice cars, they're really not adding value to the business or to themselves. If they're buying a bigger house, you could argue, okay, at least the house is appreciating. But on the other hand, if you happen to be a restaurant, I think the greatest thing in the world would be to have the cash and the wherewithal to buy another good location and own the building, or buy the building from your landlord, because that becomes not only a business expense while you're in business, it's creating an asset over time. So a lot of times the money is made by the people who have buildings, not by the ones. Not by the ones who have a good business operation.
So if I add to that, I'm in my main business is to provide the POS systems, but I do have part ownership in 2 ice cream shops. And I've been in charge of coming up and keeping up with the financial statements, which has been the best experience of my life, because I learned more than I would have learned if I would have gone to a 5-year college on how to keep books. Anyways, the point is, when it comes down to keeping from day one, I want to make sure, because there's a lot of partners, that we kept track of our assets, our owners' investments, and our equity. So now, till this day, we have all that information. If we all pitched in to buy the location, I want to call it goodwill. So we have a lot of goodwill in there, right?
Yes.
Which is just the fact that somebody randomly threw a price on there. We were all willing to pay it, and we ended up paying for it. And the idea behind this, if we do grow this ice cream shop, we have 2 locations. It would be to potentially make the ice cream centralized instead of on site. The manufacturing. And the manufacturing part of it is when I started looking into opportunity to build assets. Maybe buy a location right down the smack in the middle of everything, and we can manufacture the ice cream there and have the opportunity on the building. Problem with the ice cream shop, we had no other option. Those places where they don't work in standalone buildings. They have to be supported by a big franchise store. It has to be supported by a humongous shopping center. You cannot have one of those ice cream shops on a standalone building. You got to have a lot of walk by traffic. It's based on, it's almost like impulsive buying when it comes to ice cream shop. I feel like that's what it's been. It's like, oh, okay, I'm stopping by. Well, they see the sign, and it goes, oh, ice cream, and then they drag their kids, and their kids are going, whoa, I need to have ice cream. And so I mean, that's how it works. That's the idea behind also the type of business I went into. Is like, I like restaurants because you can potentially be a part owner of some buildings. The only downside was in ice cream shops, it's really hard to jump and buy a building. It's very difficult. And one of the things that I've always hated, this is a little bit off the subject, but well, maybe not really, but I used to do negotiations for leases for some of my clients, and they were in various retail types. And I remember being in a negotiation with a very, very large and successful luggage shop, kind of a high-end luggage shop. They had 3 big stores in Los Angeles. One of them was the Beverly Center. I assume it's still a real high-end place. It used to be the highest dollars in rent and the highest production in sales in the country. So that's kind of where they were. I didn't have much of a leg to stand on in terms of negotiating price on that particular one, I can tell you. It's like, when you're the biggest and the best, they say, hey, look, we're the biggest and the best, and we're going to charge you the most. And there's not much we're going to do here.
And so you end up trying to negotiate other things, like, well, what can they afford to give away? We need some new racks. We need to have some, got to refresh the store, that kind of thing. But, when you're in that case, I mean, anything that's attached to the wall is a leasehold improvement. The mall owns it. I mean, the mall owners really control the kingdom here. The individual retailers, they have to make the money on what they're doing inside, because there's no, unless you have a warehouse, and you can get a warehouse in tougher neighborhoods, and you have a lot of selection and that kind of stuff, but it may be worthwhile. So as a matter of fact, when I was in business, we did have a warehouse, and it just kind of happened, but we realized that as a result of having a warehouse, we could have smaller stores. And by having smaller stores, of course, we had to have smaller inventories, but that meant that we would refresh the inventory on a daily basis. And so by putting it into, the inventory into the stores, we saved money on rent until we got into percentage rent, and then it was the same thing. You get to a certain size in percentage rent, you may as well have had more space. But that's all break-even analysis, which we've talked about. So you end up in that situation, but at least there's an opportunity to buy a little warehouse or an off-site office or something like that becomes a write-off. So a lot of people like to complain about so-and-so business doesn't pay taxes. Well, part of it is, depending on your cash flow and your personal income and all your financial stuff, you get to a certain place and you're properly capitalized, you go, well, should I be paying taxes on my profit, or should I take that profit and invest it in a real asset? And therefore you don't have profit. And so, of course, you don't have to pay, so there are a few of these things that you can do in business in order to try to create asset value that isn't necessarily directly connected with the business. So, in that regard, I mean, I wish I would have considered that much earlier than I did, because I would have had a lot more to sell. And so I've started 7 businesses and I've not ever sold one of them, because most of them did not. I mean, I did sell the retail, but I sold it at like a loss because they sold it to a partner. It was going to be a lot of stress on him, and we agreed that he would have a very difficult time paying me what it was really worth, and I was ready to move on. So it worked out fine. But other than that, I've had businesses where it was my personal knowledge that couldn't be sold to anybody. In consulting, what are you going to sell? Didn't develop specific products that could be sold. Didn't want to spend time doing that. But I could have, with Red Fusion, I could have done that had I really thought it through and decided to do that. We could have positioned it.
Digital assets at that point.
Well, there's no real assets other than just computers.
Your book of business.
Yeah,
but
and we did have a book of business, but really, as the website business started to go down, it was pretty hard to maintain the rest of the business, and so it's difficult to convince somebody to buy a book of business when it looks like it's the market's going away, which it did.
Right.
Which we expected. There wasn't any surprise about it. But we were also sort of slowly retiring, and so it was just fine. And it wouldn't have been enough money to have made any difference. So, it wasn't a big enough business or enough money to have added more than a few dollars to my assets, and so it didn't really matter to me. So I will say that in my career, I was much more successful at dumping money in real estate. So it wasn't always directly related, but
there was the profits of that business.
Yeah, so you'd go, well, I'm making the payments on this house, or I had and then I had enough equity so that I could borrow and buy some rental property, and over the years maneuvered that around. And so I was able to take that and leverage that into some nice assets. But I never really had a saleable business. But I could have had I thought about this. I think that's the point.
That's the point. Yeah. So in this case, I feel like 90% of my customers took that approach. They have a sellable asset. They don't take that route. They take the profits from the business that they employ themselves from, and then did smart financial investments in real estate on the personal side.
Yeah.
But
and I think that's fine. It's sort of intuitive in a way. By the same token, there are a lot of people who don't think that way, and they don't have much. They don't have much after it's all done. They made a nice living, but they didn't. And maybe they have a house, but they don't have any other assets that are returning investment to them.
And I feel that like if these, when they're still young, they still have the energy. If they were to consider doing certain adaptations to their business model, they might have had a very sellable asset. And I feel like now that, I don't know if it's technology, times, or just the fact that the pandemic might have changed people's mindsets. But I feel like today, almost every single person I talk to is, and also the majority of it, they already had some sort of experience with dealing with the IRS or state board or whatever it might be. Their mindset is almost like switching to realizing, what can I do to turn this more into a business than me having to be stuck here working all the time?
Oh, well, okay, good.
And so a lot of them are starting to.
That's good. One of the things that Ed has brought up, and Ray Anderson as well, is that if you're working in the business, when you sell, somebody is going to get whatever you're making that may or may not work for them. But they discount the value of the business based on how much you're making. And many, many business people are not making what they should. And you couldn't hire a competent person at that same salary. And therefore they discount the business based on the salary as being too low, and therefore as a liability. And so you have to go, okay, you want to buy a business where the owner's not necessary. You want a full management team. It has to run by itself. Sure, board, no problem. You're on the board. You got a couple of other advisors on the board, which you should have. And so that's good. Now somebody can say, this business with the management can stand on its own when we buy it. So if you're thinking of building value, you want to think in terms of building a business big enough so that you can have a management team, and therefore you're creating value by having it run by itself. See, I always wanted to be so hands-on, I would never let that happen. And that was ignorant of me. I should have thought, where am I going to find new people to take my job? Now, I did have partners in some businesses where they did that, and I wasn't really necessary. But they were little fun spin-offs. They were, we hadn't built them big enough to mean anything yet. So, but I can see now where, had I done that with a purpose in mind, I really could have made a lot more money.
Well, before I jump on there, John, I'm sorry, did you have something?
Oh, well, I was going to say, it is kind of interesting because when we talk about M&A or roll-ups, I mean, often the mental image is of this giant faceless conglomerate, but there is a lot of room in the middle between like a single site owner and, publicly traded stock company.
Yeah.
And, oftentimes entrepreneurs think they have, in order to grow, organic growth of opening the second, third, fourth branch is how to do it. But I mean, really, there's kind of two ways to grow a business anyway. You either build it or you buy it. And I mean, if you're a small business owner, you're very actively engaged in very idiosyncratic management of one very successful location. Do you have the time and the skill set to be able to print again and again and again and make the exact same thing? Sometimes it may be easier to buy a pre-existing location and make the incremental improvements that are consistent with your brand, rather than, and to grow by scale, win efficiencies from shared services, the traditional play. And, so a roll up, like a portfolio of small businesses, similar to a portfolio of real estate, often ends up taking on value at a premium to a single location. And, that's saleable down the road to somebody else, or, that produces value for yourself. It gets at least to the scale where, you're getting capital accretion, like the value of the asset that you would get when you sell it, right. Plus the cash flow to actually pay yourself a decent wage and to, attract personnel that are worthwhile. It's kind of a funny thing. You can either build it or you can buy it. Right. I got some exposure to this when I was in Washington, D.C. in business school on real estate. And, what you were talking about with your retail history, Ron, and with the restaurants and ice cream stores that Edgar was talking about, is that some of the most expensive real estate in the world is retail real estate. Yeah. They command the highest premiums, but there's a huge spread, right? Because you want that busy street, you want the foot traffic, and that is incredibly finite, and that's in high demand. Notwithstanding, retail revenues are cyclical. They can be volatile. Certain things are seasonally cyclical. A lot of things are economically cyclical. So that can be a very difficult investment for a retail owner to make sometimes, especially if it's like a crown jewel prime location. So some of the most expensive real estate in the world is actually retail real estate along maybe 10 blocks of M Street, Northwest in Washington, D.C. It ranks regularly with London, Hong Kong, those huge global markets. Granted, this is not a problem that Redlands is going to face, but on a smaller scale. Right. It's actually gotten so expensive that, like you said, Ron, restaurants in that area have, in effect, began to pool resources because they're paying such a premium for retail square footage, places where you can put tables, that by building a kitchen, which, is a capital improvement, that's expensive, and then you don't get to put tables there. That's dead space. So it's gotten to such a point that the retail spaces literally just contain the tables and then maybe a prep kitchen. And then there's shared kitchen space a couple blocks away that might be, split by a couple of these restaurants really close by, functioning basically as a warehouse or a manufacturing facility. And you make all your salads there and you bring them in and you serve that way.
Right. Interesting.
I got a real stories there that I've seen already. There's a couple companies that grew up, came out, they're branded, they're known, they don't have any locations. It's all delivery food. Yes. But they're using kitchens from, and I don't know, for example, big restaurants. Yeah. That used to I believe Bucari Beppo might be one of those, where their kitchen is now being used as a ghost kitchen. Yes. For certain companies that have their website, their brand, and their online ordering systems. Yeah. And then that's it. They just know how to market it, put a bunch of money on it, and they just using someone else. So it's becoming really a thing recently. Well,
there were several companies that started building commercial kitchens across the country because they saw the market coming with COVID and so forth. And I don't know how, I haven't heard how they did. In, now that things are softening up a little bit in terms of COVID, but it shows if in fact you could do that, there's an opportunity, and I think the point is look for those opportunities. It may not be your main store, but if you could build a plant somehow. I had the warehouse that we got was actually a warehouse that was 4 or 5 other restaurants. And they were Mexican restaurants. This was a long time ago, but even then, the owner, Clyde Canino, I remember, who was a really nice guy, and I worked for him in his restaurant for a time before I got into business myself. And he already was, quote, manufacturing So all of the sauce, all the tortillas, all of the basic stuff was prepared and delivered to the restaurants, big restaurants. And then it was simply put together in the right format, So he was kind of using a Taco Bell, fast food formula in a nice sit-down restaurant, and doing it just a little bit different with his own twist, of course. But he was doing that 30 years ago. So, I mean, that's not a brand new concept, but he was kind of an extraordinary entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
And he owned the building, and he bought it, when it was nothing, and it was cheap, and he rented out the front to retailers like me. And eventually we got the warehouse too, but that was when he built a brand new kitchen in another location. And of course, he barely got through the food people, the food police, because it was an old building that needed some work, and you wouldn't really want to eat a taco. If you'd been in my warehouse and looked at it and thought they were making tacos there, you'd say, no, thanks, I don't want that taco. But he cleaned up his act and he moved on, and as far as I know, he still owns that building.
Wow.
Or his children do.
So if I were to add some idea based on the thinking of how to create a sellable asset on the business side, the opportunity of seeing this, I talked to a lot of people and they're like, I want to just work doing this. I love what I do. And I figured if I were to look into an opportunity to build a billable, an asset that could be eventually sold, it could be kind of like the ice cream shop, where there were skills that I had that needed to be put in place, that I went in there with the mindset that maybe I can buy myself out of this later in a very short-term period of time after the business is running, after I created the system, found the CPA, got the software, POS systems, and the marketing. Then I can be like, okay, this is something I want to sell myself out of it.
So there's another entirely different thing there, and that is sort of this mental attitude of, okay, we figured out how to do something. Now that's rare. Okay. You made it. You're 10% of businesses are making it. Then if it's scalable, why not consider buying the rest of the business? And in a little different way than you mentioned, JP, is you can buy business, but you can also go out and get investors. And if you have a good enough concept, and it's just a matter of replicating it, and your management systems are good, then now you've got an opportunity to actually sell a big piece of your business. You keep a smaller one that is much larger than the other one. And of course, now we're talking about the whole idea of getting capital and so forth. Now, a lot of small business people are not interested in that. And that's exactly what you're saying. I get what you're saying. I was like that. But, I look back on it now and I'm thinking, I could have just as easily done that. I mean, why didn't I?
Mm-hmm.
It was because I just enjoyed what I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing wrong with that. I think the sad part is there are a lot of good businesses today that you have people my age retiring and they can't find buyers. And it's partially because people are not thinking about buying another business like JP just mentioned. That's a good idea. And it's partially that they don't envision themselves as being able or capable of buying a bigger business. But you can get bigger businesses, $1 million businesses, for almost nothing, because there's no market for those businesses. Now, do you have the skills it takes to keep it going? Can you replicate the owner? Will he or she give you 5 years to learn? Those are all issues, but this has been sort of Ray Anderson's sort of passion, is to say we have huge assets and huge skills that are being wasted because we haven't gotten the generations together to figure out how to pass this on.
That's incredible.
And I think there's a lot of truth there.
Certainly, and it's interesting. At Georgetown, there was a professor of entrepreneurship. It's kind of funny to think that things like that could be taught. And to a certain extent, it was helpful, and certainly a lot better than having nothing at all. But the one thing they always talked about was that they said that this generation, millennials and Gen Z, for all this talk of startup culture, is on a percentage basis the least entrepreneurial generation in history.
Really?
Because many people who are in millennial or Gen Z generations move to a city, they look for the stability of a corporate career, student loans, maybe factoring in, you've got to be able to have stable income to pay those off. And so there's a barrier to entry sometimes with those. But and then it can be difficult to build equity or to start a business in a place like New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles.
Right.
Your expenses being what they are, it's going to rent, it's going to other things. On the whole, you may not be making all that much more in Los Angeles, living there, working for a big firm, than you are living in Redlands and working on your own account. But I mean, a lot of people, I don't think, consider that as an option to build equity in a business like that, and that it is truly viable as a way of building equity in yourself and making that sort of an investment. And it's hiding in plain sight. Anecdotally, there's someone I know in France who constructed one of their big three accounting firms, Mazars, and it was built out of going into business as an accountant and basically inheriting the firm from the partner when he retired.
Really?
And they were able to scale this business to the degree that it became a global multinational firm. And it was all basically built on that model where, Sky had been well educated. He went into a small practice. He proved himself to the partners of the firm. And when it was time to retire, they worked out the ability to hand on the firm. And he really did great things with that company.
That's
and asset light, as you say, it's a consulting sort of model.
Yes, it is. And who would have thought that the concept of consulting is to buy out all your customers? I mean, I haven't never thought of that. The difference is that I've always worked for different companies in different kinds of industries because I never wanted any overlap at all. I didn't want anybody to think that I was using somebody else's knowledge for their business. And so I never allowed that to happen. And so therefore I never developed an expertise in some sort of a vertical, vertically integrated. But in the accounting business, where it's really pretty well known that one accountant will have many of the same kind of business, and they're trusted not to share those figures. That really is a pretty unique idea and very, very interesting. So that's a model that could be used right here in this country, which I've never heard of here. So,
absolutely.
Right.
Well, so there's a middle tense, right? I mean, the notion of the startup literally doesn't have to be bricks and mortar by your bootstraps. Like, there's many ways to be an entrepreneur and to build value that don't necessarily require you to come in with a skill set.
That's absolutely right. And for somebody who's interested in consumer products in any way, or a craft, something that they do, I ran into an interesting model. We have some friends up in a little town in Sierra City, California, which is way up north of Tahoe. And I would say there are 300 or 400 people in town. I mean, it's literally an old gold mining town. It's not quite a ghost town, but to give you an example, 6 craftspeople were paying $40 a month for rent, and they had their own store. So you're talking,
wow,
$240. And so it's like the rent is almost nothing. It's a funky old building. They didn't quite have the right signage and some other things that can be fixed, but because of the nature of the owners, they're not doing anything online. But what a terrific brand to sell this really nostalgic old town with authentic buildings still there, and play up Sierra City as a place and as a lifestyle, and then sell products into the market where people are going, gee, I wish I could live that lifestyle. But I've got to be in Washington, D.C. in order to be able to be a part of a big firm, or whatever the case is. But it doesn't mean that there's not a market beyond Sierra City. As a matter of fact, of course, there is one beyond Sierra City. And so why can't you consider doing that? Well, I think part of the new startup model is to go to some of these small towns all across America and get the cheap rent, maybe even buy the building, and build a digital business with a location as a foundation footprint where you can do a few things. You can do some videos. You can, you play up that whole brand issue, but you sell 80 or 90% online. So I mean, there's a whole opportunity for digital businesses to be started, and they don't need to go to Silicon Valley in order to do that anymore. So
it's fascinating. This guy, Peter Thiel, I had the opportunity to hear him and some of his partners speak when I was working for an insurance company in Chicago. And they came and they spoke at a conference. And it was actually a moment that inspired me to go back to business school and sort of pull the ripcord and start to think about being more entrepreneurial. They have one of their businesses called Revolution Ventures. Right. Venture capital firm, and they have this program called The Rise of the Rest. And basically their thesis and philosophy there is that the venture capital model of this country has a bias. It has a bias towards big, deep capital pools. It's easy to raise large amounts of equity in places like San Francisco or New York. That's where, the banks are. That's where, everyone knows the story. And so the converse is also true. If you are a business with a really cool idea that doesn't necessarily sit within that pool, sometimes that can be difficult. But venture capital has become increasingly aware of that bias. And I think Peter Thiel and Revolution Ventures were among the first to move in that way. They have a program called The Rise of the Rest, which focuses on providing venture capital and investment to startups outside the deep venture gateway markets in the United States. So, I mean, certainly it's true. Like you can found a startup almost anywhere. And in fact, it might be easier to really, really get it started outside of a major sort of venture market, unless you're super asset light, like a tech company, right? Because the coding's it's all up here in your head.
Right.
But, other businesses can achieve great scale and, in fact, probably flourish better in areas where their overhead is cheaper. Real estate costs are probably the number one expense item for any business of any shape.
Well, I mean, we can all remember that little company called Amazon that had this this name which seemed to encompass the whole world, but they were, selling books out of a garage, and literally they started in a garage, and look where they are now. So I mean, if you consider the internet, you can do a whole lot of things a little bit differently, and so building value. Really, there's some other steps to building value, and part of it is the way you construct your financial statements, as we've said. But part of it is just simply thinking a little bit bigger outside of the box. How can we extend our market, and how can we create new markets, and how can we alter our existing products into new markets? Because if you can do a percentage of that digitally, you've got a real opportunity to do some interesting things and create a lot of value. And in closing out this, I thought this would be a short conversation. But in closing this out, I think the takeaway is when you build value for yourself and for your company, you're also building value for the economy, because you've got something that people will freely exchange their money for, and you can create money and value. You leave the world a little bit bigger and better place when you can do that, and you've got good ideas, you've vetted ideas, and you've eliminated the bad ideas, and just continue to move forward. That's what a free market economy is all about. That's what entrepreneurs create all of the time. So
Awesome.
well, thank you guys. This has been a really terrific kind of panel discussion, and it's been a pleasure, as always, with you guys to have a detailed discussion on a kind of a little subject for small business. And it's really wonderful having two tried and true bruised entrepreneurs to be able to share it with.
Oh yeah, got a lot of bruises.
Yes.
I love our conversations. They're always fun.
Yeah, they are. So thank you very much. And hey, we'll see you in a week or two.
Awesome. I'll see you guys. Bye.
See you, Ron. See you, Edgar.
Bet.
Bye, John. Nice.